The air in the fall of '72 hung thick and sweet with the smell of diesel exhaust and drying corn. It was a smell of promise, of money in the bank, and a winter with the bills paid. At the co-op, the talk was loud, echoing off the corrugated tin walls as farmers in dusty overalls and seed corn caps waited for the grinder to finish their cattle feed. The talk was of yields, of prices, of the Russians buying up so much grain the market was going straight to the moon. Through the chatter, a new sound cut in, the clean, almost too quiet purr of a brand new V8 engine. A cherry-red Ford F-250, gleaming with a wax job that had never seen a gravel road, pulled up to the loading dock. The driver's side door swung open and out stepped Richard Miller. Not in overalls, but in fresh Wrangler jeans and a pearl snap shirt that looked like it had been ironed that morning. He slammed the door, a solid, satisfying thud that made the older farmers look up from their talk. "Morning, boys," Rich said, his voice carrying an easy confidence that grated on the nerves. He wasn't asking, he was telling them it was a good morning because he was here to grace them with his presence. He walked past me, giving a curt nod as I wrestled a 50-pound bag of mineral supplement into the bed of my '65 Ford F-100. The old truck's tailgate groaned in protest. Its blue paint was faded to the color of a summer sky after a long drought, with patches of honest red primer showing through where the rust had tried to get a foothold. Rich ignored my truck. His eyes were on the men gathered by the office door. "Well, I did it," he announced, pulling a fresh pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket. "Signed the papers this morning. The new International is on its way. 1466 turbo, full cab, air conditioning, the works." A low whistle went through the group. A 1466 was a serious piece of iron. Over 145 horsepower at the PTO, a beast of a tractor that could pull a 7-bottom plow without breaking a sweat. It was the kind of machine you saw in the glossy pages of Farm Journal, not sitting in a field in Pike County. Old man Hemlock, who still farmed with a pair of ancient Farmall H's he'd inherited from his father, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Rich's polished boots. "Must have set you back a pretty penny, Richie." Rich just grinned, lighting a cigarette with a Zippo that clicked open with a flourish. "You got to spend money to make money, Bill. The bank understands that. They see the future. Bigger is better. You can't scratch a living out of a quarter section with a 40-horsepower tractor anymore. This ain't your daddy's farm." His eyes drifted over to me again, a flicker of something between pity and contempt in them. "Isn't that right, Jed? Still getting by with that old 4020 of yours?" I finished stacking my bags and slammed the tailgate shut. The rusty latch caught with a familiar clang. "She runs," I said, my voice quiet. It was all that needed saying. My John Deere 4020, a 68 side console synchro range, was the newest thing I owned. I'd bought it 3 years prior from an estate auction over in the next county. Paid cash. The engine hours were high, but the man who'd owned it was meticulous, and his service records were written in a neat hand in a little spiral notebook that I kept in my own shop. It was a good, honest tractor. Strong, reliable. I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of its diesel engine. When something went wrong, I didn't have to call a dealer and wait 3 days for a mechanic in a clean uniform to show up with a bill that would make your eyes water. I walked to my shed, got my tools, and fixed it myself. Rich laughed, a short, sharp bark that wasn't friendly. "She runs." Famous last words. "Jed, you're trying to fight a war with a muzzle loader while the rest of us have got M16s. I'll be done planting in a week. You'll still be out there on that green putt-putt, praying it doesn't rain and praying a hydraulic line doesn't blow." He took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out in a confident plume. "The future is about leverage, using the bank's money to get big, fast. You're sitting on 200 acres, paid for, free and clear. Your dad was a smart man for his time. But that land is lazy money. You could borrow against it, buy another half section, get a new machine like mine, and triple your income." I just wiped my dusty hands on my jeans. "Debt feels a bit like sharecropping for the bank, Rich. I like to sleep at night." He shook his head, the smile never leaving his face. "You sleep. I'll get rich." He turned back to the other men, his audience. "You boys mark my words. In 5 years, the guys like me will own this whole county. The guys like Jed." Well, they'll be working for us. The other farmers shuffled their feet, not wanting to agree, but too impressed by the sheer audacity of Rich's gamble to argue. In a world of tight margins and cautious men, Rich Miller was a lightning storm on a clear day. He was either a genius or a fool, and with grain prices climbing the way they were, it was getting harder and harder to believe he was a fool. I got in my old Ford, turned the key, and the straight-six engine turned over with a familiar loping rhythm. As I pulled away from the co-op, I saw Rich Miller in my rearview mirror, leaning against his shiny new truck, the king of his temporary castle, holding court among men who farmed with calloused hands and worried minds. He was selling them a dream of effortless horsepower, of air-conditioned cabs, of farming by the numbers on a banker's ledger. My way was different. It was the way my father had taught me. You own your land. You own your machines. You owe no man a single dime. Your wealth wasn't in the newness of your paint, but in the thickness of your toolbox lid and the knowledge in your head. It was a slower, harder path. It was a lonely path. And as I drove down that dusty county road, the roar of Rich Miller's future ringing in my ears, I had to wonder if he was right. Was I just a relic? A stubborn fool holding onto a past that was already gone? Before we go any further, I want to ask you folks listening, what was the most reliable piece of iron you or your family ever owned? The one that would always start on a cold morning. The one you could fix with a crescent wrench and a piece of baling wire. Was it an old Farmall M like my granddad's, a two-cylinder Johnny Popper, or maybe a grey and red Ferguson? Tell me your stories in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading about the machines that built this country. The spring of '73 came in wet and cold, the ground was saturated, and for 2 weeks every farmer in the county stared out their windows, watching the fields turn into shallow lakes, the coffee in their cups growing cold. The planting window was closing fast. When the rain finally stopped and the sun came out, it was a mad dash. I was out at dawn, the air still carrying a chill. The diesel in my 4020 had gelled a little overnight, but a patient minute with the ether can and she coughed to life, black smoke billowing from the stack before settling into that iconic, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of a classic Deere. I had a 6-row 7000 series planter hooked up, the seed boxes filled, the chains oiled. It was old, but it was ready. I got 3 good days in. The soil was still heavy, sticking to the tires, but the planter was dropping seed true, and the closing wheels were doing their job. On the 4th day, I was on the back 80, the farthest field from the house, when it happened. There was no warning, no death rattle. Just a sudden, violent bang from the engine, a shudder that I felt through the steel seat and up my spine, and then silence. The only sound was the hiss of steam escaping and the frantic chirping of blackbirds in the fence row. I climbed down, my heart sinking into my boots. A quick look told the story. A perfect, fist-sized hole blown clean through the side of the engine block. A connecting rod had let go. She hadn't just broken down, she had grenaded herself. My season was over before it had barely begun. There was nothing to do but walk. It was a long 2-mile walk back to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whole way I could hear it. The deep, throaty roar of a big turbocharged engine. It was Rich Miller in the field just across the road, his new 1466 pulling a massive 24-foot field cultivator, eating up the acres. He was moving twice as fast as I could, covering 3 times the ground. As I trudged past his fence line, he saw me. He throttled down the big International, the roar softening to a low grumble. He didn't get out. He just opened the glass door of his air-conditioned cab and leaned out, an elbow resting on the clean red paint. "Having some trouble there, Jed?" he called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "Through a rod," I said, not breaking my stride. "Ate herself, huh? That's what happens with old iron. Metal fatigue. Can't push 'em like you used to." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Tell you what, I'm a neighbor. I'll finish planting this field for you. For a price, of course. Say $50 an acre. I can have it knocked out for you by noon tomorrow. $50 an acre. It was highway robbery. The going rate for custom planting was maybe 15, 20 at the most. He wasn't offering to help. He was twisting the knife. "No thanks, Rich. I'll handle it." He laughed, a genuine booming laugh this time. "Handle it? With what?" You gonna go out there and throw the seeds by hand? Jed, be smart for once in your life. Your pride isn't going to pay the bills. Take a loan, buy a new tractor, or pay my custom rate. Those are your only two choices. There's a third, I said, stopping and looking him square in the eye. Oh yeah? And what's that? I can fix it. Rich just shook his head slowly, the smirk turning into a look of pity. You're a dinosaur, Jed. You just don't know you're extinct yet. He closed the cab door, the sound sealing him inside his climate-controlled world. The big engine roared back to life, and he took off across the field, leaving me in a cloud of dust and the bitter taste of helplessness. Back at my workshop, the reality of the situation settled in. A new engine block for a 4020 was not something you could just pick up at the parts store. It would have to be sourced from a salvage yard, and there was no guarantee I'd find one. The work itself would be monumental. I'd have to pull the engine, tear it down completely, and rebuild it from the crank-up. It was a job that would take weeks, not days. I spent the next 2 days on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the kitchen, its cord stretched tight as I paced the linoleum floor. I called every tractor salvage yard in 3 states. Most laughed when I told them what I needed. A few offered to sell me a whole new engine, rebuilt, for a price that was more than I'd paid for the entire tractor. Finally, a yard owner down in Missouri, a gruff old man named Earl, said he might have something. Got a 4020 that came in last year, he growled over the crackling long-distance line. Rolled it. Cab's crushed, rear end's a mess. But the engine block might be good. Can't promise anything. You'd have to come see for yourself. It was a 4-hour drive one way. I loaded up the old F100 with a chain hoist, pry bars, and my biggest set of sockets and wrenches. I left before the sun was up, driving south through the rolling hills, the knot in my stomach tightening with every mile. Earl's salvage yard was a graveyard of ambition. Acres of rusting machines sitting in silent rows, their paint faded, their tires rotted away. There were combines with their headers bent into grotesque smiles, balers seized with rust, and tractors of every color, green, red, orange, blue, all stripped of their dignity, waiting to be picked apart for their bones. Earl pointed me toward the back corner. She's over there, he said, and left me to it. The rolled 4020 was a sad sight, lying on its side like a fallen giant. But as I got closer, I saw that Earl was right. The engine, protected by the frame, looked intact. It took me the better part of 6 hours of brutal, knuckle-busting work under the hot Missouri sun. I had to cut away twisted sheet metal with a torch, wrestle with bolts that had been rusted solid for years, and carefully rig the chain hoist to the biggest oak tree I could find. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the engine block lifted free. It was greasy, it was heavy as sin, but a close inspection showed no cracks. It was sound. I paid Earl his money, a painful but fair price, and began the long, slow drive home, the bed of my old Ford sagging under the weight of my salvation. The whole way back, the talk on the radio was about the economy. Inflation was on the rise. The price of fuel was creeping up. A man with a deep voice talked about something called the prime interest rate, a term I didn't fully understand, but that sounded ominous. I got back to my farm well after midnight, every muscle in my body aching. But there was no time for rest. For the next 3 weeks, my workshop became my entire world. I worked 16, sometimes 18 hours a day. I cleaned that engine block until it looked new, honing the cylinders, checking every surface with a micrometer. I ordered a full rebuild kit, new pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets. I pulled the crank and the cam from my old engine, checking them for tolerances, polishing the journals by hand. The smell of solvent and grease filled the air. My hands were permanently stained black, the skin cracked and raw. I ate standing up, slept in 4-hour shifts. The community watched. Cars would slow down as they passed my farm, the drivers looking toward the light that burned in my workshop all through the night. The talk at the co-op, I heard later, was that I'd finally lost my mind. He'll never get it running. Should have just sold the scrap and taken the loan. That stone boy is just as stubborn as his old man, and it's going to be the ruin of him. Rich Miller finished his planting. Then he finished his cultivating. I saw him drive by one afternoon in his shiny red truck, towing a brand new boat. He was on his way to the lake. He didn't even bother to look my way. To him, I was already a ghost. Finally, the day came. The engine was back in the tractor frame. Every line was connected, every bolt torqued to spec. The radiator was filled, the oil pan was full. With a trembling hand, I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the new engine over slowly, once, twice. I gave it a tiny puff of ether, and then I turned the key again. It fired, not with a roar but with a cough and a sputter. Then another, and then it caught. The workshop filled with thick white smoke as the assembly lube burned off the new parts. But underneath it all was the sound I had been praying to hear. The steady, rhythmic, beautiful pop-pop-pop of a healthy John Deere diesel. I had never heard a more beautiful sound in my entire life. I leaned against the workbench, my knees weak with exhaustion and relief, and just listened. I had done it. I had stared into the abyss and wrestled my farm back from the brink with my own 2 hands. I was 3 weeks behind, but the corn went in the ground. It was a race against the season, but I got it done. I had won the battle, but as the summer of '73 wore on, I was beginning to understand that Rich Miller and I were fighting 2 very different wars. The grain prices that year stayed high. The harvest was a good one for everybody. For me, it meant I could pay my property taxes, fill my fuel tanks for the next season, and put a modest amount of money in my savings account at the Pike County Farmers and Merchants Bank. It was a good year, a solid year. For Rich Miller, it was a gold rush. With his big, efficient equipment, he'd not only farmed his own land, but had picked up another 200 acres of custom work from smaller farmers who couldn't keep up. The money was rolling in. Before the combines were even cleaned and put away for the winter, he'd made his next move. Old man Hemlock, tired of fighting the breakdowns of his 2 antique farmalls, decided to retire. Rich bought his 160 acres before the for sale sign was even hammered into the ground. He didn't just pay Hemlock's asking price, he paid 20% over in cash, a move that sent shockwaves through the local coffee shop conversations. He's expanding again, the whispers went. Where's he getting the money? The answer was simple. The bank. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, a man whose quiet demeanor and conservative suits were a town institution, seemed to have taken a special liking to Rich. Rich was his star client, the face of the new agriculture. Rich wasn't just farming land, he was leveraging assets. He was playing a different game. That winter, his International 1466, not even 2 years old, was traded in. A massive, articulated Steiger Cougar II appeared in his machine shed. It was an absolute monster, a 4-wheel drive behemoth with jewels on all 4 corners, looking more like a military vehicle than a tractor. It made his 1466 look like a garden toy. The whole county drove by his place just to get a look at it. It was a symbol of his success, a giant green middle finger to the old ways of farming. He bought another 80 acres that spring. Land prices were going crazy, fueled by the high commodity prices and the easy credit flowing from the banks. A piece of ground that would have sold for $500 an acre 5 years ago was now fetching $2,000, and people were lining up to pay it. The government was encouraging it. Earl Butts, the Secretary of Agriculture, was on the news every night, telling us to plant fence row to fence row, to get big or get out. Rich was the poster boy for the new era. He was featured in the county newspaper, standing in front of his new Steiger, his arm around his wife, who wore a fur coat in the picture. The headline read, "Local farmer bets big on the future." In the article, he talked about export markets, depreciation schedules, and investment tax credits. He sounded more like a Wall Street broker than a man who worked the soil. He even made a passing comment about his neighbors. "Some folks are content to just get by," he was quoted as saying, "but I believe in progress. You can't stand still. In this business, if you're not growing, you're dying." I read the article sitting at my kitchen table, the paper spread out next to a plate of leftover meatloaf. Dying. That's what he thought of me. I looked out the window at my machine shed. Inside sat the 4020, its engine humming along better than ever. My old Farmal M was parked next to it, its red paint faded but its engine sound. My planter, my cultivator, my old John Deere 45 combine, all of it was mine. Not mine and the bank's, just mine. I had no payments. My only bill was the light bill and the property tax. When I sold my grain, the money was my own. But still, the doubt crept in. At the diner, the other farmers would clap Rich on the back. They'd ask his advice. They looked at me with a sort of polite pity. I was the cautionary tale, the man who was missing the boat. My discipline was seen as fear. My self-reliance was seen as stubborn foolishness. I was a relic from a black and white photograph in a world that had suddenly exploded into Technicolor. One afternoon, I was at the bank depositing a check from the sale of some soybeans I'd been holding. Mr. Abernathy called me into his office. He was a man in his late 50s, with greying temples and glasses that made his eyes look perpetually concerned. "Jedediah, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a leather chair that sighed as I sat down. "How are things out on the farm?" "Things are fine, Mr. Abernathy. Can't complain." He tented his fingers and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Jed, your father was a customer of this bank for 40 years. A fine man. Cautious. He believed in saving for a rainy day." "Yes, sir. He taught me the same." "A commendable philosophy," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "But times are changing. The opportunities available right now, they are once in a lifetime. A man like you, with your land paid for, you have tremendous equity. You could easily secure a line of credit to expand your operation, upgrade your equipment. You could double your acreage, triple your gross income in a year or two." He slid a brochure across his polished desk. It was from a farm credit association filled with smiling families and pictures of brand-new, gleaming machinery. "Interest rates are manageable," he continued, "and with inflation running the way it is, you're practically paying it back with cheaper dollars. It's a winning proposition. Rich Miller is a perfect example." I looked at the brochure and then back at him. "What are the rates on these loans, Mr. Abernathy?" "Well, they vary. Right now, a good operational loan is around 8%. Some of the long-term land loans are variable, tied to the prime rate." Variable rate, the term I'd heard on the radio. "What does that mean exactly?" "It just means the rate can adjust over the life of the loan to keep up with the market," he said a little too quickly. "It's standard practice. Protects the bank, protects the depositor." It sounded to me like it protected the bank, period. It sounded like a gamble where the farmer held all the risk. "I appreciate the advice, sir," I said, standing up, "but I think I'll stick with the way my father taught me." Abernathy sighed, a look of genuine disappointment on his face. "Son, I hope you don't live to regret that." As I walked out of the bank, the sun felt a little colder than it had a few minutes before. The news on the car radio was on again. An oil embargo by countries I'd barely heard of. Gas lines in the cities. The president on television talking about a national crisis of confidence. And that phrase again, prime interest rate. It had just been raised, a full point. That evening, I finished my chores and stood by the fence, looking out over my fields of winter wheat, just beginning to green up. In the distance, across 2 miles of quiet, dark farmland, I could see lights. It was Rich Miller's farm. The yard lights were on, and I could see the floodlights of his new Steiger. He was out there, ploughing under corn stubble, getting a jump on next spring. The deep, guttural roar of its big diesel engine carried faintly on the night air. A few years ago, that sound would have filled me with envy. It was the sound of power, of progress, of wealth. But tonight it sounded different. It sounded frantic, desperate. It was the sound of a man running a race against a clock he couldn't see, a race against an interest payment that never slept. My farm was quiet. The only sound was the wind whispering through the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the one who was winning. A storm was coming. I didn't know what it would look like, but I could feel it in my bones, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was better to face it on solid ground than in a boat built of borrowed money. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper. It came on the wind in the summer of 1979. The wind blew hot and dry out of the southwest for weeks on end, sucking the moisture out of the ground until the corn leaves began to curl in on themselves, a thirsty, desperate gesture. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue. Ponds shrank, their edges turning into cracked mud flats where raccoons left perfect hand-like prints in their search for trapped minnows. My corn suffered, the ears not filling out all the way to the tip. But my fields were holding on. Years of ploughing under clover and manure had given my soil a dark, rich texture that held water like a sponge. I cultivated carefully, keeping the weeds down, creating a dust mulch to seal what little moisture was left. My old 4020 didn't mind the heat. The engine ran a little hot, but I kept the radiator clean, and she never complained. Rich Miller's fields were a different story. He'd pushed his land hard, planting corn on corn year after year, pouring on chemical fertilizer instead of building up the soil. His ground was compacted and pale. From the road you could see his crop suffering badly. The leaves were a sickly yellow-green, and the stalks were spindly. The real trouble for him started in July. I was fixing a fence along the road that separated our properties when I saw it. The giant Steiger was sitting silent in the middle of his biggest field, listing slightly to one side. A few hours later, the dealer's service truck, a big white Ford with a crane on the back, pulled in. 2 mechanics in clean uniforms worked on it all afternoon. I could hear the clang of heavy wrenches and the occasional frustrated shout carried on the hot wind. I saw Rich pacing at the edge of the field, smoking one cigarette after another, his arms crossed tight against his chest. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a wire-taut tension. They were still there when the sun went down, working under portable floodlights. The next day at the co-op, the story came out. A planetary gear in the final drive had shattered. It wasn't a simple fix. The parts had to be special ordered from the factory in Fargo, North Dakota. The tractor was down for the count for at least a week, and the bill for the parts and labor was going to be, as one of the mechanics had told the man at the parts counter, enough to buy a good used car. A week of downtime in July was bad enough, but the world outside Pike County was turning sour. The new man at the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Volker, started talking tough about inflation. He used words like monetary discipline and tightening the money supply. Every time he spoke, the prime interest rate, that number Mr. Abernathy had brushed off so easily, ticked upward. It went from 8% to 10%, then to 12%. The news from the White House was even worse. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president announced a grain embargo. The Russian market, the very thing that had fueled the boom, vanished overnight. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The price of corn on the Chicago Board of Trade plummeted. It was like someone had pulled the floor out from under us. A bushel of corn that was worth $3.50 one week was barely worth $2 the next. Suddenly, the math no longer worked. The high land payments, the massive equipment loans, the sheer cost of fuel and fertilizer that had seemed manageable when prices were high now became an anchor, pulling farmers down. The talk at the co-op changed. The bragging stopped. Men spoke in hushed, worried tones. They talked about operating notes being called in, about the bank wanting to see new cash flow projections. They looked older, their faces etched with a fear I hadn't seen since the driest years of the 50s. Rich Miller became a ghost. He no longer held court at the co-op. I'd see his big new pickup truck roaring down the gravel roads, a cloud of dust billowing behind him, always in a hurry, always going somewhere, to the bank, to the implement dealer, to the city to meet with loan officers. The easy grin was a memory. Now his face was a grim mask. He'd bought more land that spring, paying top dollar, leveraging himself to the absolute limit. He had planted fence row to fence row, just like the government told him to. He had the biggest, most expensive machinery. He had done everything right according to the new rules. But the rules had changed in the middle of the game. That fall, the harvest felt less like a celebration and more like a salvage operation. I brought my crop in with my old John Deere 45 combine. It was slow. I had a couple of minor breakdowns, a broken belt, a clogged auger, but they were things I could fix myself in an hour with the tools I carried in the cab. My yields were down because of the drought, but my costs were low. I owned my equipment. I owned my land. I had no payments to make. The check from the elevator was painfully small, but it was enough. I could weather this. Rich's harvest was a frantic, desperate affair. He ran his massive new combine day and night, the powerful halogen lights cutting through the autumn darkness. He was trying to squeeze every last bushel out of the ground, trying to outrun the interest clock that was ticking louder and louder every single day. I saw the fuel truck at his place constantly, pumping thousands of gallons of high-priced diesel into his tanks. His operation was a magnificent, powerful, cash-burning machine, and it was running out of fuel. The cracks in his empire weren't just showing, they were turning into chasms. The winter of 1981 was brutal, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled over the countryside. The prime interest rate, which had seemed so abstract a few years ago, was now a monster at the door. It hit 15%, then 18%. By spring, it peaked at a soul-crushing 21.5%. For farmers like Rich, who had variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. An interest payment that had been $5,000 a month was now $15,000. It was impossible. The numbers were insane. You couldn't grow enough corn to pay that kind of interest, not when the price was in the tank. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper, small print listings that read like obituaries for family farms. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had just started out, buried in debt from the beginning. Then it was established families, farms that had been passed down for 3 generations, suddenly finding themselves on the wrong side of a banker's ledger. Mr. Abernathy at the bank was no longer the friendly advisor. He was a man trapped, forced by his superiors in the city to call in the loans, to foreclose on his neighbors, on the very people he went to church with. His face was pale, his hands shook, but he did what the men upstairs told him to do. Rich Miller fought it. He fought like a cornered animal. He sold off his breeding stock of cattle at a disastrously bad market. He sold a small parcel of land his father had left him, a piece he'd sworn he'd never part with. It was all just throwing buckets of water on a house fire. The debt was too big, the interest a raging inferno. The auction was set for a Saturday in early April. The sky was a high, cold grey, and a bitter wind whipped across the farmyard, snapping the flags on the auctioneer's truck. The whole county was there, it seemed, not to buy, but to watch, to bear witness. They stood in quiet, grim clusters, their hands in their pockets, their faces full of a mixture of pity and terror. This could be any one of them. Rich's equipment was lined up in a neat, funereal row. The massive Steiger Cougar II, the giant international harvester combine with its 24-foot grain head, the plows and planters and cultivators. A lifetime of ambition, all polished and gleaming, waiting to be sold to the lowest bidder. This wasn't just machinery, it was his dream, put on public display in its final dying moments. Rich was there, standing by the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built. His wife was beside him, her face a blank mask of shock. He looked like a stranger. His shoulders were slumped, the fire in his eyes extinguished, leaving only grey ash. He looked 10 years older than he had the last time I'd seen him up close. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from the city, started his chant. The bidding was slow, almost non-existent. The prices were heartbreaking. A planter that Rich had paid $30,000 for 2 years ago sold for $5,000. A disc that was nearly new went for a third of its value. The crowd was silent, respectful. No one wanted to be seen as profiting from a neighbor's ruin. Most of the buyers were dealers from out of state, vultures who followed the scent of financial death. I stood at the back of the crowd, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This wasn't a victory. There was no joy in being right when the cost was this high. This was a tragedy. Then the auctioneer moved to the centerpiece, the Steiger. All right, folks, here she is. The pride of the fleet. A Steiger Cougar II, 4-wheel drive, jewels all around, a real ground pounder. What'll you give me? Who'll start the bidding at 50,000? 40? 30? Silence. The only sound was the wind. The giant tractor, the symbol of Rich's entire philosophy, sat there, immense and useless. The dealers knew the market was flooded with big fuel-guzzling equipment that no one could afford to run. 20,000. Somebody give me 20, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice losing its rhythm. A dealer from Iowa finally raised a finger. 15. I've got 15,000. Who'll give me 16? 16? No one moved. Mr. Abernathy, standing beside the auctioneer, his face ashen, gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The bank was setting a floor, buying it back themselves rather than give it away. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, pointing a finger at Abernathy, "to the bank for $15,000. A collective sigh went through the crowd. The great machine, the king of the county, was worth less than a new pickup truck. Rich Miller flinched as if he'd been struck. He turned without a word and walked into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. I stayed. I watched them sell his tools, his welders, the contents of his workshop. And then they came to the land. They sold it in parcels. The 80 acres he'd just bought went first, back to the bank. Then the 160 he'd bought from Old Man Hemlock. When they got to the final piece, the original 80 acres that had been his family's home place, the piece with the house and the barns, I stepped forward. The bidding started low. A corporate farming group from Illinois had a man there, and he was bidding confidently. He wanted the land. He didn't care about the family who had worked it. To him, it was just a number on a spreadsheet. When the price reached a level I knew was fair, but still a bargain, a price that would leave Rich with at least a shred of dignity after the bank took its share, I raised my hand. The corporate man looked over at me, surprised. I stood my ground. He bid again. I bid back. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing. The crowd was dead silent now, watching. This was different. This was one of their own trying to keep a piece of the county from being swallowed by outsiders. Finally, the corporate man shook his head and dropped his hand. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, his gavel pointing at me, "to Jedediah Stone." I didn't look at the house. I walked to the auctioneer's table, my hands trembling slightly as I wrote the check. I had used nearly every dollar I had saved, the careful, patient profits of a decade. But it wasn't an investment. It was an act of preservation. A few days later, I saw a moving truck pull out of Rich's driveway. I drove over and found him in the empty machine shed, sweeping the concrete floor, the only thing left for him to do. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes hollow. "Come to gloat, Jed?" he asked, his voice raspy. "No, Rich, I came to do this." I held out a set of keys. "They're the keys to the house. I'm not a landlord. I don't want to be. You and your family can stay. As long as you need to, you can work the home 80 for me. We'll split the profit 70-30, your favor." He stared at the keys, then at me. His face, a mask of hard pride for so many years, began to crumble. His eyes filled with tears, and for the first time I saw the farmer, the man who loved the land, not the businessman who loved the ledger. "Why?" he choked out. "After everything I said, everything I did." "Because we're neighbors," I said, pressing the keys into his hand. "And this whole damn thing, it wasn't your fault. You just believed the wrong people." He couldn't speak. He just nodded, his shoulders shaking. I left him there, in the echoing emptiness of the shed that had once housed his dreams. My vindication wasn't in his failure, but in my ability to offer him a hand when he had fallen. My father's way hadn't just allowed me to survive, it had allowed me to be a neighbor. The years that followed were lean, but the storm passed. The farm crisis of the 80s left deep scars on the landscape and on the people. Many farms were lost forever, consolidated into huge, faceless corporate holdings. But many of us who had held on, who had farmed with caution and weathered the storm, remained. The community's perspective shifted slowly, like a river changing its course. The talk at the co-op was no longer about getting bigger, but about getting smarter. Men who had once laughed at my old 4020 now came to me asking for advice on how to rebuild a carburetor, or set the timing on an old tractor they'd pulled out of the weeds to save on fuel. My workshop, once a symbol of my stubbornness, became a gathering place, a place where knowledge was shared and old iron was given new life. I never charged for my help. It was just what neighbors did. Rich and his family stayed in the house. He worked the home 80 with a quiet, fierce dedication I had never seen in him before. He used my old Farmall M, a tractor he once would have scorned. We never spoke of the auction again. We didn't need to. An understanding passed between us, forged in the fires of that terrible time. He had learned the difference between price and value. Life settled into a new rhythm. I eventually married a schoolteacher from town, a woman with a kind heart and a steady soul. We had a son and we named him Thomas, after my father. One warm autumn afternoon years later, when Tom was about 16, I found him in the workshop. The door was open and the late-day sun slanted in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was standing in front of the 4020, the one I had rebuilt all those years ago. He had the service manual open on the fender, its pages soft and stained with the grease of 1,000 jobs. He was carefully adjusting the valve lash, his movements precise and focused. He looked up as I approached, a smudge of grease on his cheek. "Dad," he said, his voice full of the quiet confidence of a young man who knows his way around a wrench. Number 3 intake felt a little loose. Figured I'd run through 'em all while I had the cover off. I stood there for a long moment, watching him. He was using my father's tools, working on my tractor, in the same shop where I had poured my own blood and sweat to save our farm. The engine block, the one I'd hauled back from that Missouri salvage yard, was warm from a day of dissing. It was more than just a machine. It was our history. It was our legacy. "Your grandfather taught me how to do that right here in this spot," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "He always said a man who can't fix his own tools is just renting them from the man who can." Tom nodded, wiping his hands on a red rag. He was right. He looked from the tractor to me, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Rich Miller told me the story once, about how you rebuilt this engine when it blew, how everyone said you were crazy." I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. Being called crazy is sometimes just another way of saying you're on the right path, but you're the only one on it. I put my hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder that would one day carry the weight of this farm. The smell of the shop, of old steel, grease and rich soil, was the best smell in the world. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. The land was quiet. The corn was ready for harvest. The bills were paid, and we owed no man a single dime. We were free. And in the heart of America, that was the only kind of rich that ever truly mattered.